I know that there are many questions, starting, of course, with the question we all want to have an answer to, what was there before the first universe. But I suggest to proceed slightly differently. You will have the opportunity during the break to interact with the four speakers at one of the tables and ask the questions that I will not ask you to raise now. Instead, I would like to ask a very simple, but I think important question to you. I would like to begin with Jean-Luc here. And the question is, what difference does your research make? What impact does it have? What follows from it, be it to your own research field, be it to neighboring fields, be it to society at large? Jean-Luc.
Yeah, so for me that's a particularly hard question to answer, because of course the research I'm doing will not make any car go faster and will not have a direct impact. I think the consequences are really more, perhaps on a philosophical level, that if we know how the universe is made, it just gives us an idea of what our place is in the universe, and maybe a way of appreciating that place. On the other hand, I just think that it's fascinating in itself that without even leaving our small little planet, we can find out all these things about how our universe evolves, and perhaps even we can find out about the existence or non-existence of other universes. I just think that in itself is a reason to pursue this.
Yes, I think this kind of meaning, the search for meaning, is part of also what we look for in terms of results that we get of it. And while you were speaking, I was also reminded that in the history, in the cultural history of humanity, we have many ancient texts, if you go back to some of the Sanskrit texts and to others, where you have the myth of origin. And there are two kinds of myths of origin. There's a sort of, the point in time when the creator or the higher being started to create the world and us and the universe. And you have other cyclical worldviews where there's an ongoing process, a force in the universe. So I think what you are doing on the scientific side resonates with some of the oldest ideas that people have had in every civilization, in every walk of life, thinking about exactly the same questions. I turn to Mary now.
Well,
what do you think follows from what you are doing?
I mean, in some senses it's very obvious. As I was trying to explain, I'm hoping to make the world a more secure place. But I think what's really significant about the research is that I think it's very difficult to make the world a better place or a different place without changes in the way we do social science. And so much of the social science that we have at present, particularly political science and international relations, are based on very traditional assumptions about the nature of war, about the nature of state interest. And actually it's deeply embedded not only in the questions they ask, but also in the methodologies. Just to give you one small example, everywhere you will see the use of conflict data that is supposed to measure insecurity. All that conflict data, all the quantitative conflict data that currently exists, is based on the assumption that to be a war it must have a certain number of battle deaths and a state must be involved. Actually, if you look at what's happening, and that's one of the reasons you get a big celebration of the decline of war at the moment. Whereas actually, if you start from different assumptions, I'm not sure whether violence is increasing or decreasing. We simply don't have the right kind of data to be able to tell that. And so I think very important is to have an impact on the way we think about these things in social science, because that does influence the way policymakers and practitioners think about that. And in our research, it's turning out to be very, very interesting. We're developing with very many different kinds of approaches, including the sort of anthropological approaches that Rebecca was talking about. But we're trying to rethink quantitative indicators. We're doing a lot of work on narratives and the difference between the narratives of the people who are insecure and the narratives of policymakers. So actually this is turning out to be very fruitful, and I hope that will be how we make a difference.
Thank you. I think you're right that one of the major challenges for the social sciences is to catch and to translate into new conceptual tools the general changes in our attitudes. Now, our attitudes to war has changed. If you go back to 1914, the first major world war that has hit Europe, in all the atrocities that were to follow, we are changing our attitude to that. And I think we have to grasp it also conceptually and in terms of data. Nick.
Okay, so I just echo Jean-Luc's point that, and I agree with him that for me, my motivation is to understand how we came to be. And I think it's really important to get a perspective on the evolutionary process that produced all the living organisms around us and produced ourselves. But I think also understanding that process, understanding the importance of diversity, of recombination in producing the innovations that species depend on to persist and to progress, that's also important, understanding how the process works. And then finally, there are actually indirectly practical implications, particularly in making sense of DNA sequence data, understanding how we can find out which particular variants affect your susceptibility to some disease or affect the yield of some crop or whatever. Those kinds of practical questions are also tied up with the same kind of theoretical issues that I was talking about today.
If I may just add to this, I think in terms of how we are beginning to understand the evolutionary mechanisms better and better, this also offers a way of transferring our understanding to other areas. And you do this, for instance, in computation. You are using algorithms that you derive from evolutionary theory, you apply them to data. But also, I think what you are beginning to follow is to look at evolution that you can somehow trigger in the lab. You work with fruit flies and other organisms in the lab, so you can study something in the lab. But to compare this with evolution in the wild, with this infinite, it's not infinite, but it's a very long stretch of time that evolution had. And I find this also very, very interesting and, you know, pushing us further. Rebecca, you gave us this wonderful presentation also on the great variety and diversity of this very inveterate human behavior and social behavior that gambling is. What do you think makes a difference in terms of your own research and that of your group?
Thank you. Well, I feel quite strongly that in order to regulate gambling effectively, we need to know about it as well as does the industry. And at the moment, the existing research paradigm prevents us from doing that. I remember when I first started to work on gambling, and I worked out that both regulators, governments, the research community, and the industry were all in agreement about how best to study it, that I felt this raised some concerns. And the current paradigm, which many of you will be familiar with, is to focus on so-called problem gamblers, who are identified as such by national surveys using questionnaires. And the rather disturbing political impact of that paradigm is that gambling is then presented as harmless fun for the majority of people and simply a problem for a minority of people who are defective in some shared way. And my concern is that we turn that on its head somewhat and say, we want to reopen questions about the place of gambling in our lives. We don't simply want to be saying, who are these people for whom gambling produces an addictive response and so on. Rather than closing off questions, I hope my research will open them up.
Thank you very much. And with these questions, the many unanswered questions, we go for the coffee break. And you have the opportunity to engage and ask the questions that you were not able to ask now to the speakers. Thank you.